Hi, this is Jolien. I am from the Netherlands. I'm currently serving here as part of the leadership team for YWAM Kona, and then I help lead a ministry called Revival and Reformation. And I want to share a brief story just about surrender in my own life, how God called me, and I felt like He invited me to surrender everything, follow Him unto whatever end, which led to seeing God move all around the world. And I know if He can call me, I know He can call each one of us. And that surrender really is the qualifier to live a life with Jesus that touches the nations. And then I'll talk a little bit about Europe at the end as well. And just from one of my recent trips where we led a leadership training in Europe, seeing a little bit of what God's doing there and seeing a real rumbling for revival and reformation among young people all over. So first, when I was 18, I was at the end of my high school. I'd wanted to be a missionary since I was like 8 years old. So gripped by the story of Corrie ten Boom, who was also from the Netherlands. And I'd read her story where she wrote in a book, story after story of God calling her to go to a country. And she would go in obedience to Jesus with a suitcase. And then seeing God move as she went, hearing the sound of His voice. And I would read her story and see the impact that her life had just by walking in simple obedience to Jesus. I remember reading her story thinking, if this is possible, what could my life look like when I learn to hear the voice of God and obey Him unto whatever nation? And so when I was in my teenage years, that only began to grow. I would take mission trips, but not fully knowing what that would be unto in terms of the next decades of my life, for example. And so at the end of my high school, I was 18 years old. I told the Lord, I said, I don't want this to just be a good idea, where I read Corrie's life story, and now I think that I want to do that. I want it to truly be You. If you're calling me specifically to be a missionary, would you speak to me? And so last year in my high school, I'd wait night after night, waiting on the voice of God to speak and show me what He had for my life. I wanted a God dream, not just a good idea. And so I remember one night I was waiting on the Lord, and this thought was so clear, came to me in Dutch, but it said Matthew 4, I'll make you a fisher of men. So I didn't know it was in Matthew 4. I grab my Bible, I look it up, and I read the story of Jesus calling some of His disciples, saying, come, follow me, and I'll make you a fisher of men. And I remember reading their response, saying they left everything and just immediately followed Jesus. And in that moment, I knew that God was calling me to a life of surrender, starting right there, that would look like following His voice. And I knew in that moment, I felt something in my spirit that He called me to be a missionary and to follow Him to the nations all around the world. And so as I started to pray more into that in the following weeks, I felt the Lord really speak to me about youth with a mission. And I started to research some and ended up finding a DTS here in Hawaii that I felt the Lord was highlighting. And so a month before I went on an airplane to Hawaii, America for the first time, I was praying with one of my friends. She prayed for me and said, I feel like you'll go to places you never thought you'd go to. And especially for your outreach portion of this discipleship training school, which is 3 months of a lecture phase, then 3 months of an outreach. As she's praying that for me, I have another very clear thought saying Himalayas. And I remember leaving her place. I remember cycling home, as we do in the Netherlands, thinking about this word Himalayas, thinking, I know they're mountains. I have no idea where they are. I think somewhere in Asia. And I wonder if I'm going to go there for my outreach. So I kind of put that on the shelf and went to Hawaii. And then when they said, these are the outreach locations, and they had a list up there, Himalayas was one of them. And I heard that we would be the first trekking team that then would take backpacks full of Bibles, going to the Himalayas, to unreached people groups. And I remember as they brought up the word Himalayas, my heart just started to burn. I remember when I was in my teenage years, I was encountering the heart of God over the unreached when I read out of Romans 10, this portion in verse 13 to 15, I think it is, that how can they call on His name if they've never heard? And how will they hear unless someone tells them? And how will someone tell unless they're sent? And I remember in my teenage years, I was so gripped by that passage out of Romans 10, praying, God, if there's any way You could use me to reach the unreached, the answer is yes. And when Himalayas was up there and they were telling us that we would go to unreached people groups, I was reminded again of Romans 10, saying, God, I'll go if You call me there. And so I submitted that location. And 3 months later, I was hiking with my team with backpacks full of Bibles, hiking in the Himalayas, going to village after village after village, praying for the sick, showing a Jesus film in Nepali in their mother tongue, and giving out Bibles, hard copy Bibles and SD cards, seeing people get healed, blind eyes open. We saw so many give their lives to Jesus, whole households being saved as we preached the gospel with the translation. And it was incredible watching God move there. And especially in moments where our team would be high up in the mountains, so cold, sitting around a fire, worshiping Jesus and being like, God, let this be a place where instead of idolatry that's existed for centuries on end, that this would be a place where a house of prayer would be established in the unreached villages here up in the mountains. As people read the Bible and get touched by the love of Jesus, that worship and prayer would arise from all over the Himalayas to be like incense to Jesus. And so it was an incredible time. This was about 10 years ago, and ever since I've continued in YWAM, go to different places around the world, and trying as best as possible to obey the voice of Jesus. I remember being from the Netherlands. When I first said I'm going to be a missionary, there was so much pushback. From a cultural point of view, it was like I was wasting my life, throwing it away. And I remember in that time, when I was a teenager, God really had to renew my mind and say this might be a waste in the eyes of the world, going without the degree that I didn't have back then, and without maybe a plan for the next 10 years of my life, but just going because He called. That the Lord is showing me that kind of countercultural act of obedience was wisdom in the eyes of God. That kind of waste was a waste so worth it, but really not a waste in the eyes of God. It was the way to become a disciple of Christ. Now, there are so many things I've had the privilege of being a part of, but I want to just highlight Europe as well, because I know Antioch is also going to be doing incredible things there. We were there in November, December with this ministry I help lead now, Revival and Reformation. We gathered about 45 young leaders from around the world in Amsterdam. And we pray there in the heart of the red light district in this prayer room every single day, praying for God to raise up revivalists and reformers that would go to the ends of the earth, to come against areas of injustice, to bring the gospel of the kingdom, to look at Bible illiteracy around the world, just contending for breakthrough in so many of these areas of global missions. And we had so many Europeans as part of our team, and we'd always pray for revival in Europe as well. It was amazing what God did in that month, and then hearing these stories of people from Norway and Sweden and the UK, where it seems like this common thread that people want the real thing. All over Europe, it's these pockets of revival, people coming together around the presence of God, but also with a real dissatisfaction that what this postmodern culture is teaching them, that truth does not exist, you live your life, you live your truth. It's not what this generation is looking for. It's actually gripping them with fear, anxiety, to the point of being disillusioned about what their life is really about. Now, what we heard from all over Europe, and I continue to hear, is these headlines, even in the news. In Sweden, it's predicted that Jesus will be the most popular person in Gen Z, given by the government's news headlines, all over these other places in Europe. From Hungary to Albania to the UK to the Netherlands, people are coming together, letting go of this cultural view of life and saying, if there's truth, I want it. I want to be set free. I want a sound mind that actually leads to peace. But I've also noticed that Gen Z wants to live for something that's worth it. And I believe when we present to them a vision of global missions, to bring your calling or maybe your vocation, your gift mix to the table, to say, God, how can we see justice in the nation, righteousness, revival and reformation? I believe all over Europe, this young army is rising that says, I want to give my life to something that's worth it. And I believe we have an incredible vision to give to them. I look at my own life as being from Europe. If God can do it in me, from a small town in the Netherlands that people have never traveled the world. If God could call me and grip my heart for missions, I know He can do it in anyone. And I can say it's been so worth it to live absolutely surrendered, seeing a harvest all over the world. So I hope and pray that God speaks to you as you come together for this gathering.